Hi everyone, so today's tutorial will be a little bit more advanced, and today we will be recreating the effects from Cyberpunk Phantom Liberty end credits. And as I said, it will be a little bit more advanced. It will be mostly geometry nodes and some materials, and this tutorial requires a little bit of knowledge of basic Blender and how things works. So if you want to try to anyway, you can always slow down things, and you should be able to follow even with minimal experience. So the creation of these effects is mostly two parts. The first one will be the geometry nodes, and we created the base for our hologram system, and then we will spend the most of the part inside materials to create complex procedural material that allows to be animated and create a lot of interesting things. The last steps will be just adding some quick compositing using new Blender viewport compositor option. So let's jump into new blend file and start making the cyberpunk effect. Okay, so to create our hologram we will need three base elements: the camera, the image that we want to project, and the geometry of the hologram. Let's delete the lamp because we don't need this. Now we have the camera, the hologram object, and we need one more, which will be our image. To import image to Blender I will use the add-on called Image as Planes, and to activate it you need to go to Edit Preferences and search for Import Export, Import Images as Planes. Activate this, and now when I use the Shift-A shortcut you can search for the option Image as Planes. Now you need to search for your image. I will use the Cyberpunk one and press Import Images as Planes. So this effect based heavily on perspective. The image will be perfectly visible only in one angle, so we need to choose that angle now. Let's rotate camera to base rotation by selecting it and press Alt-R. And now we can rotate it to place it however we want. I think placing it something like that would be good. Now let's place this image somewhere behind the camera. And if I go to Material Preview, as you can see we have our cyberpunk image. As you can see, the rotation of the image matches perfectly rotation of the camera. So this will be our default position. Okay, now we can go to Geometry Node Setup and add new Geometry Nodes network to our default cube. I will need to create the base plane that I will scatter the lines for our hologram. Because our image is mostly horizontal, the plane will also have mostly long proportions. So let's add simple grid node, and this node will allow us to create simple plane-like geometry. As you can see, currently it has subdivision as level 1, and we can decrease amount of vertices by changing the values of vertices X and vertices Y. Now we can scale it by changing the size, and as you can see our image is here, so I will just increase and decrease the scale to something like this. I will also move it much closer to the camera. Now we need to scatter some geometry on it. So I will create Distribute Points on Faces node and plug it here. I will need a lot of points to create this hologram effect, so I increase density to something around 700. Now we need base instances for hologram, so I will just use instance on point node and also curve line as our instances. Let's plug it as instance. As you can see, we have our base lines now. Let's increase the length of it, and let's place it a little bit lower. Now I would like to randomize the length of each instance, So let's use the scale instances node, and that will enable us to scale instances individually. And to do this randomly, I will just drag from scale and search for random value. I will leave the minimum as 1 and the last input as -1, something around it. And now we have really random nice lines. Remember, you can always back to this setting later. The last step will be realize our instances. And now we can go to create the hologram. Let's frame it and let's call it maybe scatter base lines. Okay, now I would like to project our image to these lines to create a basic attribute that I will later use in our material network. So to do this, first I need to resample this curve because the attribute will be stored in vertices. So as you can see in this example, we have only vertices on top end of the curve, which is not a lot. If I try to project this image, we can't see anything because we don't have enough geometry. But soon as I will increase the density of points on this curve, the image became more clear. This is exactly how screen resolution works. If we only have horizontal or only vertical pixels, we will not see much. So to fix this problem, I will just use resample curve node. Let's increase to something like 100, and we will play with it later if our image will be too foggy or too unclear. Now let's create the attribute. To create attribute, we will use the store named attribute. This will allow us to store information inside each point with specific name. I will use the colors, and the value will be type of float, because we don't really need the information about the yellow or red or anything, because at the end we will be choosing our own colors, so we can use now just a grayscale. So to project information from this image, I first need this image in our geometry node network. So let's pin it, and from outliner let's drag our object. As you can see, if I preview our image, it's completely wrong position, but we can fix it pretty easily just changing the option from original to relative. To project our information now, we will use Raycast node. So let's drag and search for Raycast. Now we have the same problem because our original geometry has only 4 points. So let's first create a vertical line, and this will allow to more evenly distribute the geometry and the attribute. So as I said, we have the same problem now with 2 little vertices. So let's add subdivide mesh node here. The simple subdivide, not subdivision surface, because we don't want to ramp anything. As you can see now, we have much more points, but I think the 7 will be even better. Okay, so now we need to choose the direction of our projection, and we of course want to project it in this direction. So to check the direction of faces, we can use the viewport overlays to check the face orientation option. And as you can see, the front is in this way and the back is in this way. So let's invert it by going to edit mode and using Shift and shortcut and check checkbox inside. Now we have this direction as a front, which is exactly what we want. Let's turn off overlay and let's use normal node to choose the direction inside the geometry nodes network. Now we are shooting on our hologram geometry. Now we need to choose what we want to project. So we need to connect some attribute here, and we of course want to choose our texture that is put in the material. So how to select it? First, let's search for this image by using image texture node. And this node will allow us to choose the Cyberpunk JPEG. We can preview, and as you can see, it's completely wrong. And this is because we don't have any UV map plugged into our image. So how we choose the UV map? First, let's check the name of it. If you go to Data tab and under the UV maps, as you can see, it is called UV map. So let's copy that name and let's create the named attribute node. And this node allows us to check any information that is stored inside of geometry. And the UV map is one of it. So if we change the type to vector, because UV map is a vector, and search for UV map, as you can see, this is our UV map. Now we can connect it to our image texture, and now everything works perfectly. Okay, so we have our attribute. Now, as I said before, we want to use grayscale, not color. So let's convert it by using color ramp. This allows us to convert it to black and white, but even more, it will allow us to play with a contrast, which can be pretty useful. Okay, let's connect it to our attribute. And now we can project this attribute to basically anything, for example, for our hologram geometry. So to do this, we need to store this attribute inside our geometry. So let's just connect the attribute output from Raycast to our store named attribute. And now we can preview it by using another named attribute. So let's duplicate it and let's choose colors. And as you can see, we have our basic effect. So if you look from the side, we don't really know what is it. But if you go inside the camera, we clearly start to see our Cyberpunk poster. So this is the part when we can choose our camera position. So let's go into full screen, and under N panel, let's select under view, camera to view. And now when we start moving, we also move the camera. So let's place it something like. And now we don't want to change the rotation because it's good. So let's only change the position of the camera to match it. If we press G and Z double times, we can move to the front. And I think something like this will be good for now. We can try to increase the resample curve resolution. As you can see, now it's a little bit sharper, but I think it's pretty good for now. So we have our attribute. Let's frame it by pressing Ctrl J, and let's call it create basic color attribute. Okay, so we create the base color attribute, but for final effect I will create some more attributes. The first one will be camera depth. So as you can see, the camera depth represents the distance between our camera and the current element of the hologram. So we can distinguish the one closer to us and this one which are farther away from us. And this will be pretty useful because it will allow us to modify the effect using shaders. But this will be later. Let's first create this attribute. So to use it, I will duplicate my store name attribute by pressing Shift D, and to get it outside of our panel, I will press Alt P. Okay, let's connect it. And now we need to change the colors to a camera depth. Okay, so we have our storm named attribute, but currently we have only 0 as value. So I called it camera distance, but actually what I want to use, not a camera, but a plane roughly the size of our hologram geometry. And this is because in my solution, if we use a camera, it will create these results, and I want something more like this. and the plane parallel to the hologram geometry will be perfect for that. Okay, so to actually create this attribute we will need few nodes, but first we need to know the location of our camera. So to do this, I can just select our camera and drag and drop it from our outliner to our geometry nodes network. Let's change the position to relative to actually represent our camera position. And now I would like to instance some plane on our camera so we can check the distance using geometry proximity node. So we can do this pretty easily by instancing on corrector location and using rotation from our camera. So let's add instance on point node. And we can't use our geometry from camera as our point because camera isn't a point. But we don't need it anyway, because we have location, output and rotation. Let's connect rotation to rotation. Now how to connect the location to our instance on points. As you remember, we need some points. So let's create a single point using points geometry nodes. And as you can see, it has position input. So let's connect location to position and our geometry to our points. Now the last thing that we need is instance, and for that we can use a simple grid geometry node, which is something similar to a plane. If we connect it to our instance and preview it, as you can see we have a simple plane exactly at the position of our camera, and if I change the position or the rotation, everything's work perfectly. So what is here going on? It's we create some points that have exact position of our camera, and then on that point we create a grid and we rotate that grid to match the rotation of our camera. Now the last step is to realize this instance to create actual geometry. Okay, let's change the size of our plane to match the size of the hologram geometry a little bit better. And now we need to calculate the distance from this new created plane to our hologram element. And to do this, we can use the geometry proximity node. Okay, let's connect it. And what geometry proximity node is doing, it's telling the distance between two geometry elements, between input, between target, and between anything that will connect our distance for. So if I connect the distance to our stormy attribute, now the geometry proximity is telling the distance between our plane and our hologram elements. For our shader editor, we need distance in the range 0 to 1, and this is because the colors are working in the range of from 0 to 1 mostly. Of course we can use the map range node inside our shader network, but I find it more convenient to create it here, because here we can create automatic ranges. So let's use map range node. Okay, so we know our target from 0 to 1, but we don't know the maximum value. We need to calculate somehow maximum value, and this will be just the maximum value of our distance. So we need to know the higher value of our distance to actually map range correctly. And we can do this pretty easy by using attribute statistic node. And let's connect distance not to selection but to attribute. And this node will allow us to actually check a lot of things, but what we need is the maximum value. So let's connect maximum to from maximum. And this actually doesn't do anything, and this is because we don't have geometry plugged in. So let's connect our hologram elements. And now we can calculate the distance between hologram and our target, and we can calculate the maximum value of it. Then we map range, and now if I preview this attribute by using Ctrl+Shift, so as you can see we doesn't see much, and this is because we need to change the from minimum value. As you can see, if I increase it, we see much better contrast between our values, and this perfectly represents our distance, and we actually doesn't need to guess the value because we can connect the minimum output. And this creates the perfect results. One issue that we have is this straight line here, and this actually comes before here. If I delete our viewer node now, as you can see, we have this line over here, and this is because our instances are starting from 0 and ending on 3 meters, but they are not going anything under. And if I decrease this value, as you can see, everything is much more randomized. So I think I will use the -2 and something like that. If I preview the attribute camera depth now, as you can see, we don't have this weird line, and our color attribute is working now perfectly too. Okay, so this will be our attribute, camera depth attribute, and so let's frame it by selecting and pressing Ctrl J, and let's call it camera depth. The next attribute that I would like to create is a spline parameter. This attribute is just a gradient from top part of our curves to the bottom part of our curve. This attribute will be pretty useful to create this nice effect of glowing ends in our final material. So it will be actually pretty easy. Let's just store named attribute node. Let's call it spline parameter. And the only node that we need to connect here is spline parameter node. So let's use factor. The difference between factor and the length is actually the same like in our camera depth. So the length is from 0 to something something in meters, and the factor is from 0 to 1. And this would be perfect for our material network. Okay, so let's frame it and let's call it spline parameter. Okay. The next thing that I would like to create is those wiggly lines. As you can see in the final effect, not every line is perfectly straight. We have some wiggly ones, and let's create it now. So to do this, first I need to separate some lines to make them wiggly. So let's use separate geometry nodes to do that. Separate geometry. Now we need to create some sort of selection, and I think for that we can just use the random value node. As you can see, currently it's selecting points, and we want splines. Okay, so we don't need to select a lot of geometry. I think something around 0.06 will be enough. And now we have separated wiggly ones from not wiggly, so let's make them wiggly. And to do this, I will just use simple set position node. And we need some noise texture now. So let's create basic noise texture. And I would like to change the shape only in X and Y axis, not in the vertical one. So to do this, let's multiply it. As you can see, I use the color output, and we need to multiply the final axis by 0, the Z1, and this two by something smaller. This will be use of our strength control. Let's connect it to offset. And as you can see, we have our effect now, but everything seems to moving. As you can see, if I increase it, it's going into this direction. And this is because by default the color is from the range 0 and 1, and if we are moving in 3D space, especially randomly, we want to move in all directions, and -1, 2. So let's add one node before our multiply, the map range node. As you can see, this one is a little bit bigger because it's vector 1. Let's connect it between, and we need to map range from 1 to minus 0.5 to 0.5. Thanks to that we have randomness in every direction possible. So if I look it now and start increasing our strength, as you can see, it's not moving anymore. So we don't need anything super strong. I think this effect will be enough, something around 0.1. And if you don't like the result, we can always change to 4D and play with W. It will basically work as seed value. You can of course change the scale of the noise texture too. Okay, so now we have our wiggly geometry and not wiggly. So let's join geometry back together by using simply join node. So now we joined both type of geometry, but what would be really nice is to have attribute that will enable us to separate it inside our material networks later. So let's create two storm named attribute node, and let's call it wiggly. It's duplicated, and this attribute would be just simple boolean. So let's change both type to boolean, and this one that have deformation from the noise texture will be true, and this one that doesn't have any deformation would be false. So now we have attribute that will allow us to check if something is wiggly or not. Let's frame it, and let's call it wiggly lines. And the next step would be to convert our curves to actual mesh so we can render it, and we can do this pretty easily by just using curve to mesh node. And now we need some profile. It will be simple curve circle, but remember to not set the resolution too high because it will crash Blender. So let's set resolution to maybe 4. And as you can see, it looks like a mess, and this is because our radius is much too high. So let's set something more like 0.008. I think this is pretty good. We can also enable fill caps option to fill our ends of the curves. Let's maybe make it a little bit smaller. Okay, let's frame it, and let's call it curve to mesh. And the last part would be create our last attribute, and this will be just a random index. So I would like to create a random index from every curve. So to do this, I would just use, and again, a storm named attribute. Let's call it random ID. I will leave it as float, and let's use the mesh island. This node will allow us to add different number integer for every single geometry part. So this will be just the value 1, 2, 3, 4 and go on. And I would actually like map it to 0 to 1 again. So let's use the white noise texture. And let's connect our value. If you preview this attribute, as you can see, we have a random color from each curve, which is exactly what you want. Okay, so let's frame the last part, and let's call it random ID. So this will be it for the geometry node part. Now the fun part comes, the material. So let's jump to shading. Let's go to camera, and so let's open render view. As you can see, I am using Eevee, and now we need to create the material. So first on, As you can see, our material doesn't affect our geometry, and this is because in our geometry nodes network we need to actually add at the end set material node. So let's add set material and let's choose our material. We can maybe rename our material to Cyberpunk Hologram. And as you can see now, changing the color, it affects our hologram. The one thing that I would like to change now is the distance between the hologram and the camera, because as you can see we have only a small part of our hologram in the camera view, and this will affect of our final resolution. So let's jump back to geometry nodes and let's preview our color attribute, and let's scale our hologram cyberpunk image element. And now I need to place the camera a little bit further, and thanks to that we will be having a better resolution. Okay, so this is really the end of the geometry nodes, and let's back to our material. So as you can see, the final material is really complex. We have a lot of nodes here, but basically everything is pretty simple because we are using the attributes from our geometry node networks and just mixing some colors. We have some additional fun nodes, but I will explain everything in details. So let's jump into the shader network and let's start from our colors. So I need two attributes from our geometry nodes network: our color information and our camera depth. So to doesn't make any mistake, let's copy the name from our attribute colors and let's add attribute node inside our materials. Let's paste the name, and if I preview our material now, as you can see, this is the effect. So our geometry node system works perfectly. If I start to rotate our view, as you can see, it's only perfectly visible from one single angle. I think that maybe this line are a little bit too thick, so I will decrease the thickness a little bit more. But we can come back to it later at any moment. Okay, so let's duplicate our attribute node, and the second attribute that I will need is camera depth. So let's back to camera depth frame and let's copy the name and let's paste it here. I will go to render view, and as you can see, now we have our attributes inside our material network, and this is pretty powerful tool. So first I would like to separate some lines based on camera depth, so let's use greater than node, and this will allow us to separate some lines that are really close to the camera. As you can see, the problem with our hologram now is that we have solid frame on our image. Everything outside our image is black, and this will look really weird in our animation. So to fix that, let's use the color ramp node. And now I would like to make such contrast that will create the basic white rectangular. Let's move it down and this up, and let's invert this now by using simple invert color node. Now we have the black rectangle, but as you can see we have some white spots, so let's decrease this value even further. Now we have totally black rectangle, and let's multiply these two values together by using multiply node. I'm choosing mix, which is the color operation, and let's multiply this two. And if I preview it, as you can see, we have this nice effect, it will help the merging between two things. Let's duplicate our color attribute. Okay, so now I would like to add these two values together, because if I add our original colors in this black spot, it will fit perfectly and I would be able to match it together. So let's just duplicate the multiply node. Let's change it to add. And let's actually switch order. And now with our factor, I am able to control the brightness outside the frame. And if we duplicate this multiply node and connect it with our greater than, we are able to control this line here too. And with these two controls, I am able to mask this effect. It's not perfect and it will probably work better with better image, but inside camera it looks great, and in final animation it doesn't stand out too much, but you can probably fix a lot with better image, and this solution is pretty good too. It doesn't look that bad in the final material. So let's maybe frame it, and let's maybe call it base color frame. And now I would like to create actual colors, and from the reference I will be using the color from the original end credits from the Phantom Liberty DLC. So let's create color ramp, and let's select a few colors. So I would like to leave the black one to have great contrast, so I will just press the plus to add another one. And let's choose some darker shades. Okay. And something really bright now for the white. Okay, let's duplicate it by pressing Ctrl-Shift-D, and let's choose some different shades. So now we have two options, and you can play it however you like, maybe change colors a little bit, but it will come back to this color later when we will have actual shader. So what I would like to do with two color ramp is to mix them using the random ID that we created in our geometry node network. So let's go back at the end and copy this name. Let's go back to shading and let's create another attribute node and paste the name. As you can see, this is our random ID, and I would just like to mix between these two color ramps based on that. So let's add mix node. Let's plug both color ramps, and let's plug this color to our factor. And as you can see, it looks a little bit different. And if you want to increase the contrast between these two, you can use color ramp between our random ID and our mix node. So now if I increase the contrast here, as you can see, we have more clear division between colors. It's nice to have that control, and we will be playing with every control at the end when we have final shader. Okay, so we create the color, and let's create first shader now. So let's delete our principled BSDF, because I will just use simple emission shader. Let's plug our color into it, and as you can see, this is our current effect. As you can see, it's a little bit too pink in my opinion. And I will change the color now to the ones that I use in the final render. So for the first lamp I am using this color, and to the bright color this one, and for the second ramp, for the dark shade, I'm using this color, and for the light shade I'm using this color. So these are my final color. As you can see, let's decrease the emission to 1. Let's also change the word color to black. So let's go to word and change the color to black. Okay, this is our current result. I also don't want to see everything outside my camera, so I select camera and go to viewport display, and after passport to option, let's increase it to 1. Thanks to that, we will see only what our camera see, which I find less distracting. Okay, so now we can play with our material furthermore, and first thing I would like to create this wave effect. And as you can see, it's pretty a lot of nodes to do that, but it's mainly due to animation and it's not really that complicated. So first let's create wave texture. So let's maybe first move it here and let's join these nodes and let's call it colors. And back to our waves, let's create wave texture. Let's preview it. As you can see, we don't see much, and this is because currently this texture is projected directly on our mesh, and what we really want is to project it on our camera. And to do this, I will create texture coordinate node, and if we plug our window option and change the X to Y, as you can see, we have now horizontal lines. Let's increase the density. I have something around 63. As you can see, pretty dense. You can, well, of course, change it if you like. Let's also increase the distortion a little bit. I think something around 4 will be good. Now let's try to animate it. So first let's animate our distortion, and to do this I will just use mapping node. And if we animate this value, as you can see, it's animate our distortion. So let's maybe bring the timeline. And at frame 1, let's make a keyframe by hovering over this and pressing I. And at the end of our animation, let's make another keyframe, but let's maybe increase it to a little bit bigger value. Now if I play animation, as you can see, it's a little bit slow, so let's maybe increase it. And you can also enable auto keyframe option, so if you change value of keyframe, it will be changed automatically. Let's check interpolation mode and set it to linear. And now I think it looks pretty good. If it's too small, you can always decrease the scale a little bit to see the effect a little bit better. Okay, so let's now move it along the z-axis, also animated. So let's now create the constant movement in z-axis for our animation. So let's another mapping node. And now I would like to animate only the Y component. So let's go at the beginning of our animation and let's keyframe it. And let's go at the end and increase it a little bit. And now if I play our animation, let's change the interpolation to linear. And as you can see, it's moving pretty fast. So let's maybe go at the end and let's decrease it by 2. and I think it's okay for now. So we have animation of our Y wave texture completed, but what I would like to do is to create a little bit more complex effect. So let's first create the color ramp node and plug it here. And instead of the black, I will use a really light gray, exactly this color. And let's increase the contrast a lot to create mostly similar in width waves. Let's maybe decrease the distortion tiny bit. And let's duplicate this by pressing Ctrl+Shift+D. Now let's duplicate this color ramp too. Let's plug it. And here I will use normal black color, but let's invert our color ramp. Okay, and why we are making this? To add these two color ramp together. Let's use vector map add. And as you can see, we have pretty interesting effect. And if I add multiply here before our adding, I will have better control over what we are doing. And as you can see, now we have this little weird gradient, and what I'm trying to achieve is this fading out effect. So if I change now the phase offset of the second wave texture, and if I play with color ramp now, we can create more complex gradient effect. So we will back to this value at the end if we want to change something, but the last thing what I would like to do is to create a little bit more randomness, and for that the perfect attribute random ID. Let's duplicate it and Alt-P to get it out from the frame, and let's add another color ramp here to have control over contrast. I will invert it and make it brighter, and let's multiply our wave textures by this color ramp. Okay. Now we will have some more randomization. Okay, so let's frame it and let's use it as a strength for our emission. Let's plug it, and you can use Ctrl spacebar to maximize the viewport. As you can see, now we have pretty interesting effect already. We have our horizontal lines and the difference in strength between our hologram lines. Let's call this frame wave textures. So this next attribute, it's called random Frenel, and it will basically create some Frenel effect on some hologram lines. So let's first create our Frenel. So let's add Frenel node, and if I preview it, as you can see, it's basically the sides of our lines. So to have better control, I will again use the color ramp. It will probably be the most used node in this material. And let's increase a contrast a tiny bit, and maybe a white part too. Okay. Let's add again our random ID node. And we'll be using random attribute to select some lines. So let's maybe add less than node. And let's increase this value. Actually, let's maybe increase this value, and let's invert it. Okay, so we can play with this threshold, and I think this is pretty good. So let's multiply both effects, this time by using simple math node, and let's set it to multiply. Now we have this Frenel effect on some of these lines. And to actually use it in material, first I will duplicate our emission and move it like that. And let's use the same color here, maybe like this. And let's add mix shader node, and let's mix those two shaders by our Frenel mask. If I preview it now, as you can see, we see these horizontal lines, and this is because the emission strength is really high, and I think something around 8 is pretty good. Okay, so this is first effect. And for the final material I created this node structure to keep some order. So let's take back the color a little bit higher, because we'll be using it a lot, and move this a little bit lower, and let's frame it, and let's call it Frenel. Okay. So the next effect, it's called darker bottom, and it's basically will create the gradient that will make the bottom part a little bit darker. And for that we'll be using new parameter, new attribute, and we'll be using the spline parameter. So let's copy the name, and let's create a new attribute node, and let's paste the name. As you can see, it looks like that. And to actually use it, we'll again use the mix shader node and the emission with our original color. So we can actually duplicate this emission node, Ctrl-Shift-D, and Alt-P to get it out of frame. And let's reconnect the color to have a little bit better order. So this is our color, and we want to mix these two together based off our attribute. Of course, we will again use the color ramp to have better control, but now we have everything. So let's add mix shader, and we want to mix these two together based on this. Let's switch the order of inputs. And as you can see, we have the brighter parts down, and what we actually want is to have darker parts. So let's decrease the strength significantly, and let's increase the contrast now. As you can see, we have this nice gradient from the bottom. And what I think I will do now is to increase our base Frenel effect by increasing this a little bit. And let's just add multiply at the end. And I will set it like this to increase the strength a little bit. Okay, so let's frame it and let's call it darker bottom. And our next effect, it's called end brighter, and it will just make the ends of some lines brighter. So let's again duplicate our emission with base color, This time we'll increase the strength a little bit. Let's duplicate our mix too. It's connected already. And now we need to create the mask. And for that, I will just duplicate our spline attribute. And again, let's create the color ramp. And let's use it as our mask. So, to separate the top part, I will preview our attribute. And if we increase significantly the black values, as you can see, we selected the top parts. So if I preview our material now, as you can see, we can make the endpoints of the curves brighter, which gives pretty nice effect. We can control the length of the bright part and the fall off by using color ramp. Okay, so let's frame it and let's call it curve ends bright. Okay, so the next effect is called wiggly lines, and this one will make the endpoints of hologram lines only of wiggly curves a lot brighter. So it will be similar to this, so we can duplicate the whole thing by pressing Ctrl-Shift-D. And let's delete this connection and let's connect it like this. And what we need to change is first our mix will be no longer based on spline param attribute, but instead let's duplicate the attribute and search for our wiggly parameter. Let's copy it and let's paste it. Let's use it as our mix shader mask. And if I increase it now, as you can see, we clearly see the wiggly lines. And what we actually want to do is to connect this as strength. And now I would actually want to highlight both ends. So let's add another control. And with for control, we have nice control of all effects. I will make it even a little bit gray. And if you see our effect now, we can add maybe simple map range node, not a vector but converter. And if I increase to max value, as you can see, we can clearly see the wiggly lines now, but I don't want to make it too visible, so I think something like that will be good. Okay, so the next effect will be the random horizontal lines, and this will just create this nice looking horizontal lines somewhere. So to do this, I will again use the wave texture. And again, texture coordinate. And let's plug window. Let's preview it, change to Y, and decrease scale a little bit. Now using color ramp, make a lot of contrast. And let's increase distortion. I think it's a little bit too big now, so let's maybe duplicate this color ramps to make it even more thin. Now we need to multiply it by noise texture, so add one noise texture. And we do this because we don't want this line on our all canvas. we only want it some places. So let's plug noise texture to window 2, and let's duplicate maybe this color ramp, and let's see our noise texture. Let's maybe decrease the scale, and I will change it to 4D to have this option. Okay, so I want strong contrast, and this is because I want to multiply these two. So if I drag and search for multiply from mix, if I see it now, we need to set the factor to 1, and as you can see, now we have our random line. We can play a lot with the values to have different results. Maybe this one. And to actually use it, again, let's duplicate our emission and plug it to our base color. We need a really strong strength here. Let's add mix shader, and we need to mix our original with our current results. Let's preview it, and we will be using this as our mask. So we need to wait a second, and as you can see, now we have this horizontal lines. We can maybe decrease the strength a little bit, but this is the effect. So let's frame it and call it horizontal lines. And the last effect will be pretty simple. Let's just add simple mix shader, and let's add transparency BSDF. Let's mix it, wait a second, and as you can see, it doesn't change anything, only if it's full 1 it's getting dark. And this is because by default in Eevee, under material settings, we need to change the blend mode from opaque to alpha hashed. I will change the shadows too. And as you can see now, if I increase it, it's start to getting interesting. Everything starting merging together, which can make pretty interesting results. As you can see, if I switch between, it's getting more blend out, and I think that's pretty cool. So let's frame our last effect and name it transparency. Okay, so this will be it for the material. The last part is to start tweaking it and animate the camera to make this nice effect. So to animate our camera, we will actually need another camera, because currently this camera is connected to our geometry node system. And this is good because this is a perfect representation for our hologram. This is the angle that we want to see our final hologram. So let's just rename it camera from camera to camera perfect angle, and let's just duplicate it and rename it to camera. Now we can switch the camera of the scene in the scene setting, and now we can start the animation. You can specify the range of the animation to be anything you like, and this perfect position should be something around this frame. And to make a keyframe, just go to N panel, and in item, by pressing I key, you can make a keyframe on location and rotation. I'm also enabled the auto keying option. Thanks to that, when I change my position on timeline and move the camera now, I'm using the option camera to view to be able easy change the position. Maybe something like this. And as you can see, the keyframe was actually automatically made. Let's turn off our camera to view option. And if I play our animation now, as you can see, we have nice transition. So let's make the last keyframe inside our hologram somewhere, even behind it. Something like this. And if I play our animation now, we have really nice effect. In this frame we probably are crossing our cyberpunk image, so we can turn off the visibility on it in render and viewport. And as you can see, it's pretty easy to make this animation. You can tweak it a little bit, maybe duplicate this frame to stay a little bit. And maybe you can play to create a desired effect, but it's pretty simple to make animated camera like this. So in terms to animating the material, we first need to select our object to see the material, and I will show you the example how to animate our horizontal lines, and we will do it in the wave texture panel. And under the mapping node, if we play with Y value of this, as you can see, we are moving our waves, and this animate the jiggly effect. So we can go at the beginning and make a keyframe of both, and let's go at the end and let's edit this value just a tiny bit. If I switch the camera to our perfect angle and see animation now, as you can see, we have nice animation of our material. I think a big difference in our material compared to the final one is the density and the width of the lines. So let's quick go back to geometry node and change the curve circle in curve to mesh to be a little bit smaller. And maybe we can play with density a little bit too. Okay. I like this effect a little bit better, but you can play with a lot of settings to customize your effect. So this is how we animated the property in the shader, and we can animate a lot of properties. For example, we can also animate the noise texture of the wave to make this horizontal line a little bit more live. You can really animate everything, so let's just play with that. So this is my final result. As you can see, I played with some values to make it more pop out, and I also enabled the composer option to make the bloom effect. It's pretty simple. Just in composition I enabled the compositor and just add a glare node at the end. So this will be it for this tutorial. If you want to grab the final file, you can check link in the description. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you liked the tutorial and learned something new. And if you want to support the channel, you can check my Blender add-ons and asset packs. Links in the description. Here are some examples of my Blender add-ons. Thank you so much for watching again, and bye!